So I want to really zoom in on I was asked particularly to speak about Wordsworth, but I can't speak about Wordsworth without really coming to him through Coleridge. I mean, I don't think Wordsworth would have been Wordsworth without Coleridge in one sense. I mean, if you think about the prelude, which of course we could have made the topic, but it's rather too vast, that's a poem addressed to Coleridge. Coleridge, I think, would be perhaps a little bit harsh, but I think he did a lot of Wordsworth's thinking for him. He was a much more profoundly and rigidly, systematically a philosopher than Wordsworth was, but I think he gave Wordsworth a tremendous sense of depth and support and resonance, which allowed Wordsworth to do the things in poetry that he was particularly good at doing. So I'm not going to apologize for the fact that although I want to look at the heart of this will be a little kind of walkthrough. Wordsworth's snappily titled Ode on Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. That man needed an editor. He really, you know, that's not, I mean, I'm going to come to him through Wordsworth. I'm going to start with a remark that Wordsworth makes in one of his lectures on literature, which is a particular way of defining a poet, and it certainly applies to Wordsworth, possibly to Coleridge, where there's a little bit of teasing thought about whether, in a curious way, R.S.'s later poetry does give him an access to his observations and his appearance of nature as a child. But Coleridge says this, it's on your handout. I'm sorry for such a long handout, but I find, you know, when people put things up on projectors, I want to make notes, and I can't very well go up and write on there. So it's quite nice, I think, just to have a piece of paper in your hand, and you can doodle or jot. So the first thing I say here is this. In the poet was comprehended the man who carries the feelings of childhood onto the powers of manhood, actually into the powers of manhood, who with a soul unsubdued, unshackled by custom, can contemplate all things with the freshness and the wonder of a child. So it's a very interesting, as it were, definition of the poet, that the poet has not extinguished that children's perception, or has somehow recovered it, somehow recovered the sense of wonder, the sense of awe, the sense of seeing things for the first time, what Chesterton called the buried sunrise of wonder that we all carry kind of underneath the weight of our other perceptions. I think this passage also relates to, I haven't given it you on the handout, but the very famous account in Coleridge's biography, Literaria, in the 14th chapter, when he's looking back at what he and Wordsworth thought they were up to when they wrote the lyrical ballads, casually changed the course of English poetry, but didn't realize they'd done it. They went off to Germany, and everybody was going, who are these guys? How do I get in touch with them? They were elsewhere. It was published anonymously, of course, that book. But looking back at it, Coleridge says that what Wordsworth in particular was trying to do was, and I'm quoting Coleridge directly here, was to awaken the mind's attention and to remove the film of familiarity and selfish solicitude which we've cast over nature by the lethargy of custom, the habit of just same old, been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, I'm not going to look at this anymore. To remove that film of familiarity, as a result of which, because of the film of familiarity, we have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. But once that film is removed, says Coleridge, we are awakened to the freshness and the wonders of the world before us. Now, that's really interesting, simply as a statement about what poetry does, and I think we'll see Wordsworth's Ode is precisely the question, how can I do that? Is it even possible for me to do that? But it's interesting for this reason. If you get, if you did sort of English O-level or A-level, or had to read one of those sort of Noddy's guides to English literature, with all the periods, you tend to get the Romantics described as somehow an inward turn. It's all about the inner moving, kind of strange, weird private subjectivity of the poet in his lonely genius. And they often tell you that's because there was a split going on more widely between the kind of dispassionate, essentially analytic and atomizing empirical account of the world, which consisted of sort of a grim reality of meaningless facts. That all the values were evacuated out of the objective realm and reimagined in the subjective realm, and lo and behold, the Romantic poets popped up and helped you to do that. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, Wordsworth and Coleridge are not saying, well, we accept that everything out there is grim and meaningless and a pointless, random concatenation of atoms in the void. Our consciousness is a mere epiphenomenon, but at least we'll make it interesting for you. And we're going to decorate the insides of your psyche with some little pictures to make up for the grimness of what's out there. On the contrary, these poets were saying, precisely because you have abandoned your imagination, precisely because you have over-rationalized, precisely because you've submitted to this false distinction between out there and in here, you're not seeing the world correctly. And Coleridge and Wordsworth, by awakening the mind's attention, are as much concerned with the acute observation of what is actually the case as anyone who polishes the kind of beautiful convex curve of a telescope's mirror. They were about seeing things as they are, and they simply said, we've stopped seeing with both eyes, we're only seeing with one, and there's a problem with that. So that's the first thing, that I think they're really concerned with what is the case, as much as the nascent science was, but they were using a different set of instruments to come at it, and it was Coleridge who did the thinking about how it is that the imagination is a reliable means of perception as well as the reason. And what did they see? Well, what they saw with that eye unsubdued, unshackled by custom, the child's eye contemplating with the freshness and wonder of the child, was that they saw, as children do, a world full of personhood and consciousness and meaning. You know, all small children who draw the sun with a face. And they know more than we do, who've decided that the sun is just a meaningless blob in the sky that happens to be the unfolding of gases. C.S. Lewis got this brilliantly when in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, his sceptical modern character, Eustace, meets somebody who is in fact the human embodiment of one of the glorious heavenly bodies and one of the stars of Narnia. And he's introduced this chap as a star, and he says, rather rudely to us, he says, well, in our world, a star is just a ball of gaseous matter exploding continuously in the vacuity of space. And the star replies to me, says, even in your world, that's not what a star is. It's just what it's made of. You know, a vital distinction. So when they looked out, what they saw was a world which was kind of, well, rather like Larkin said later, the trees are coming into leaf like something almost being said. They got very close, I think, to hearing what was being said. Coleridge is probably one of the few poets who actually read Newton. He read the optics, and Coleridge rejected the predominant model of reality, a model of the physical reality of the world, which was mechanistic and clockwork. And the idea that it's what he called this whole watchmaking scheme of things. That it's all been wound up long ago, and whatever created it is now retired to an infinite distance, and it now unwinds and runs down inevitably by some kind of predictable mechanical way. He said, well, that's one model, but here's another one. Supposing the physicality of all that meets us and the way we perceive it is not a piece of clockwork, but a piece of poetry. Supposing it's an utterance, supposing it's being spoken, supposing it not only has, as poetry does, its particular rhythm and physicality and beauty, and poets slow down language so that they can savor the sheer beauty of the sounds as well as what the sounds mean. But supposing it's also a poem. I mean, the analogy might be this. The poem, you have the poem, the Ode on Intimations of Immortality here, and you also have a bit of a poem I'm going to read from Frost at Midnight. I could give you all those pieces of paper, and we could spend a good year being fascinated by the chemical composition of the paper and the exact thinness of it and the source materials that went into it. We could then do a statistical analysis on the frequency with which the letters were repeated, and again do an analysis of the ink, and we could come up with all kinds, and we could accumulate a huge amount of incontroversial, perfectly true, objectifiably verifiable, factual information about what we'd received, and never know that it was a poem. But if at some point somebody read it to us, we might go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize it meant something. Now, once we heard it as a poem, that would not change or annihilate or set aside any of the perfectly true statistical and chemical and other information we had about it. In fact, some of the information we had about it, in terms of the way the letters worked, would help us to see beautiful patterns in the weaving of the poem and the sound and the music of it. But until we knew it was a poem, we would have facts without meanings. Later on, because he drew so much on Coleridge, C.S. Lewis, realizing we needed to reincorporate the imagination, which is the facility which allows us to receive the poem, as well as the reason which allows us to analyze it. Lewis, in a late essay, said, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. And again, one of the problems we have, because we've accepted a split and we've downplayed the imagination and assumed that it's only about the imaginary or made up, is that we've seriously wounded and debilitated our capacity to perceive meaning. So the more and more we know about the world, the less and less it means to us. That's a problem, and it's not a problem about the world, which is still as meaningful as ever it was. It's a problem about those instruments of perception, those faculties to which we bring it. And both Coleridge and Wordsworth were convinced that happily, even if you happen to be born, as we are, into a deeply divided and essentially kind of schizophrenic age in which the hemispheres of our mind are almost at war with one another, when you're born, that split is not in you. That split, that downgrading of the inner and evacuating of the outer of any meaning or value is something you learn. And both Wordsworth and Coleridge were concerned to recover that inner vision in order to unlearn what the Enlightenment philosophers were already doing to their minds. And they saw childhood as the key to that. So I've given you a little bit from Frost at Midnight, where Coleridge has reflected on his own schooling. He's, been in the close city pent, and saw naught lovely but the sky and stars. And he wants his child to have a different kind of education. The poem is set in the little cottage at Netherstowe, and the infant Hartley is slumbering peacefully at last at his side. Coleridge is being the full-on new man and looking after the diapers and letting Sarah get some sleep and sitting up in front of the fire. And then he looks at his child and he thinks about the kind of education he wants that child to have. And this is what he says. But thou, my babe, shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountains, and beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk both lakes and shores and mountain crags. So shalt thou see and hear. Now, I'll just pause here for a minute. The kind of Noddy's Guide to English would make you want to say, so shalt thou see and hear, and have a wonderful walk in nature. A nice day of nature study, and you can pin the leaves in the book and draw something. That's not what he goes on to say. This is his account of the cosmos, really. So you're beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk the lakes and shores and mountain crags. So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all, and all things in himself, great universal teacher, he shall mould thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. Oh, it's fantastic. If you want a good account of what good teaching is, it's by making somebody ask. That's what it is. The lovely shapes and sounds, the phenomena of nature are also words, their meanings. Shapes and sounds of that eternal language, which thy God utters. I have seen this passage, this very passage, cited in textbooks to suggest, either approvingly or disapprovingly, that Coleridge was a pantheist. And it's actually this very passage which demonstrates that he wasn't a pantheist. A pantheist is about pan, everything, theos, God. A pantheist thinks everything is God. My waistcoat buttons, this microphone, the cars outside. The whole physicality of the cosmos is itself divine, and there's no distinction. It's an ancient position, it's a respectable position, but it's not the position of Coleridge. And the key, of course, is the word utters. All of this, of course, God is in it all because it's his poem, but it's like saying, Shakespeare utters forth Hamlet, and then if you were inside the world of Hamlet, you'd be wandering around saying, well, where's Shakespeare? I'm testing everything, I'm looking. Who is this invisible friend of yours, Shakespeare? You say to Hamlet. Well, of course, you can't see him. He's uttering the whole thing forth. It's in his mind. Shakespeare is everywhere and nowhere in Hamlet. He lets Hamlet be what it is, but he utters it. So that eternal language which thy God utters. Linguistically, of course, the word utter in its deepest roots is related to the word outer. So when you utter something forth, you make what was inner outer. If you're a poet, you make what is inner outer for a moment, in a beautiful moment of transmission and musical passage, so that it may become inner again in the minds and hearts of your hearers and be remade, and remade uniquely and differently in each hearer. So you will hear and see something of God. God will be speaking to you through all these things. And what he will be teaching is himself in all. Yes, he is there, and all things in himself. And yet he is, because he is the speaker, he is transcendent. There's both immanence and transcendence, not mere immanence. And then this beautiful, great universal teacher, he shall mould thy spirit, and by giving, make it ask. He's always wanting to open the child's questioning and curiosity up. So a third little bit of Coleridge before we get to what is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of a rather long poem by Wordsworth, but it's not as long as the prelude, so, I have mercy. So this is a letter, sorry, a note haven't come here, in which Coleridge is giving a bit of a biographical account of himself to somebody who wants to be his patron. And he talks about children's reading. It's very nice to be saying this in a school, in a primary school, I'm sure. In fact, a lot of Coleridgean principles. There was a woman, Charlotte Mason, who took up a lot of his ideas, and there's a whole series of Charlotte Mason schools in America. But I think a lot of what happens very well in primary schools, and sadly doesn't happen in secondary schools, are precisely the kind of principles about a child's imagination that he enumerates in this letter. So let's hear what he says. For from my early reading of fairy tales and genii, etc., my mind had been habituated to the vast, and I never regarded my senses in any way as the criteria of my belief. That's just wonderful in itself. He wouldn't go for this only seeing is believing unless I can weigh it and measure it and cut it up and analyze it. It's not there. He knew there were hundreds of invisible things, and the deepest and most moving things in your heart, like love and joy and the ability to notice beauty, are not physical things that can then be chopped up, but they're nevertheless very real. I never regarded my senses in any way as the criteria of my belief. I regulated all my creeds by my conceptions, not by my sight, even at that age. Should children be permitted to read romances and relations of giants and magicians and genii? I know all that has been said against it, but I have formed my faith in the affirmative. I know no other way of giving the mind a love of the great and the whole. Those who have been led to the same truth step by step through the constant testimony of their senses seem to me to want a sense which I possess, They contemplate nothing but parts, and all parts are necessarily little, and the universe to them is but a mass of little things. That's very true. It is true that the mind may become credulous and prone to superstition by the former method, i.e. reading fairy tales. But are not the experimentalists credulous even to madness in believing any absurdity rather than believe the grandest truths if they had not the testimony of their own senses in their favour? I have known some who have been rationally educated, as it is styled. They were marked by a microscopic acuteness, but when they looked at great things, all became a blank, and they saw nothing, and denied very illogically that anything could be seen, and uniformly put the negation of a power for the possession of a power, and called the want of imagination judgment. And it puts his finger right on, where our culture went wrong, just about the middle of the century, at the end of which he was writing. He's writing that at the very end of the 18th century. So that's, if you like, a little bit of background of the kind of thinking to which Wordsworth was exposed by Coleridge. Now I want to really go through this extraordinary ode and see both what it has to say about childhood for them, but also perhaps for us. And I feel really bad saying this because I'm on Team Coleridge rather than Team Wordsworth, I have to say, but Wordsworth experts may want to shoot me down at this point. I think this is a great but uneven poem. I mean, part of the problem is that it's a poem about oscillating back and forth between a transfigured vision and a reductive vision. But it also moves between kind of a genuinely transfigured language and astonishing phrases which become a permanent part of the equipment and furniture of your mind once you've read them. And then passages, frankly, of almost auto-writing, nice nature things. Somebody once wrote a satiric poem about Wordsworth, which began by parodying one of his own phrases, "Two voices are there." So, but this one, I can't remember who it was. It wasn't Browning, but it was somebody like that. He said, "Two voices are there. One is of the deep, the steep, the cloud, the cataract. The deep, one is of the deep, the steep, the cloud, the cataract, the deep abyss. The other is of an old half-witted sheep. And Wordsworth, both are thine." He can write about things being apparelled in celestial light and the glory and the freshness of a dream. And he can write lines like, "I measured it from side to side, 'twas 2 feet long and 3 feet wide." What do I do? So I think we move a bit between layers of language, but it's worth it because what is golden and great in this ode is as good as anything in the English language and has huge truth to teach. If Seamus Heaney was right when he said that poetry may not be recollected whole, but that what it always offers are, in Heaney's phrase, phrases to feed the soul, then this poem must be one of the richest treasuries of phrases to feed the soul ever written in English. So let's look at its fame. So we have this little preamble. The child is father of the man, a wonderful paradox, very strikingly put and very true. And the more we look at psychology and understand the influence of early years, as they like to say now, on the whole trajectory of the person, the truer we see Wordsworth was when he said that, the child is father of the man. And I could wish my days today to be bound each to each by natural piety. Now, what he means by natural piety, we'll have a little look at. So here's the beginning. It calls itself an ode, but it actually starts in quite an elegiac way. By that I mean elegy is lament for loss, usually the loss of a person. In one sense, this entire poem is a lament for the loss of childhood vision. It's, as it were, looking at Coleridge's thing and saying, the child brings into the adulthood, the poet brings into adulthood and into the powers of adulthood the vision of the child. And Wordsworth is saying, thanks, Coleridge, but actually I've lost my vision as a child. But here's the paradox. In the very act of expressing poetically the vision that he has lost, he recovers it. I mean, the very thing whose absence he laments is itself entirely summoned by the lament. And we are the beneficiaries. It's almost as though he doesn't notice it's happening. There was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I can see no more. That sets not only the tone of elegy and lament, but also, in a sense, it sets the polarity of the whole poem in those two: common sight, celestial light. From the rest of the poem, we alternate between the two. And it's the capacity to rekindle the vision of the celestial in the common, or to borrow a phrase from an earlier poet, to see heaven in ordinary, that the poem is really about. So, let's look at the next little verse. I'll just pause a little after each verse. So the rainbow comes and goes, and lovely as the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious birth. But yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Again, he sees, he can appreciate that something's missing. The rainbow comes and goes is a very beautiful image for this whole poem, because that sense of seeing a rainbow and then disappearing and then another angle of light and the rainbow comes back. And the rainbow is a real thing in the sense that more than one person can see it at the same time and recognize that it is. And yet it's not a real thing in our normal sense, because it takes the power of our shaping mind and our particular perspective of eye to see it. And yet that is real. The rainbow is the very thing that puts to the question our ludicrously oversimplified division between subjective and objective. And in a sense, the vision of this poem comes and goes like the rainbow here. That's the sort of almost the archetype for the poem. So, we'll take a couple of verses now and just, sometimes I want to zoom in and make a comment, and sometimes I'll just let it roll. Now, while the birds thus sing a joyous song, and while the young lambs bound as to the tabor's sound, to me alone there came a thought of grief. A timely utterance gave that thought relief, and I again am strong. So you see the coming and going, oh, something tragic is happening to me, but if I can express it, at least I can get back to where I was. The cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. No more shall grief of mine the season wrong. I hear the echoes through the mountain throng. The winds come to me from the fields, come to me from the fields of sleep, and all the earth is gay. Land and sea give themselves up to jollity, and with the heart of May doth every beast keep holiday. Thou, child of joys, the key word of this poem is joy. Thou child of joy, shout round me. Let me hear thy shouts, thou happy shepherd boy. Ye blessed creatures, I have heard the call ye to each other make. I see the heavens laugh with you in your jubilee. My heart is at your festival. My head hath its coronal. Now there, heart and head are keeping time together. That split isn't there. The festival and the coronal rhyming them. The fullness of your bliss, I feel it all. It's a recovery. Oh, evil day if I was sullen, while earth herself is adorning this sweet May morning, and the children are culling on every side in 1,000 valleys far and wide, fresh flowers, while the sun shines warm. And then he looks at the child, the babe. The babe leaps upon his mother's arm. I hear, with joy again, joy I hear. And then suddenly we're back into the difficulty as he remembers. But there's a tree of many one, a single field which I have looked upon. Both of them speak of something that is gone. The pansy at my feet doth the same tale repeat. Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream? And he asks those open questions, and then he begins to let you know, if you like, a little of the kind of philosophical frame in which he's thinking. And I mean, when it comes to these textbooks, either ticking off or applauding Wordsworth and Coleridge for different heresies, and Coleridge, of course, came back to a fully Trinitarian Christian belief, which in no way diminished his visionary gleams, but gave a good account of them. Wordsworth, at this point, I think, has absorbed a kind of Platonic understanding that there is this realm of the true and the good and the beautiful of God himself from which we come. And he follows Socrates in saying that once we're born, we forget the true world, and we live here in the shadowlands, and then we mistake them for the real thing. But sometimes they remind us of the glory, and this is why Socrates said that all learning is anamnesis, it's remembering. That the truest things we remember from this early state. Now, strictly speaking, when the first Christian fathers thought about that, they didn't want to go along with that idea of the pre-existence, the pre-fleshly, pre-incarnate existence, and particularly with, possible further incarnations. But once they began to develop the theology of the Logos that's there in the prelude to John's Gospel, and begin to say the divine mind, the Logos, the word in which all things, that in him all things were made, and without him was not anything made that was made, and the he in whom all these things were made is eternal, the eternally begotten Son of the Father. They began to say, well, maybe there's a way of saying that there is, even before our birth, the divine idea of who we are, God uttering who we shall be in time, but conceiving who we are fully in eternity. And he always sees that in us. He always lets the world mold and shape us, and then when all things have gone wrong in the fall, he sends the Son so that in the Son we can re-become, if you like, the beautiful child that he made us to be. So there is a way of getting back into something of what Wordsworth is talking about here. So this is how Wordsworth puts it. It's extraordinary. Now we are getting into the great soul-feeding, soul-nourishing phrases, I think, of this poem. Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its sitting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness. That's such a beautiful revision. A sleep and a forgetting, and then he corrects himself. No, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. That's astonishing writing. And we all use, like, certain phrases like trailing clouds of glory have simply entered into common parlance from this poem, but we scarcely ever remember where they came from. And we sometimes use that phrase ironically about somebody who happens to be a celebrity temporarily, that they're trailing clouds of glory. It's the exact opposite of what Wordsworth means by it. He really means that when that infant first opens their eyes and cries and breathes the air and snuggles at its mother's breast, that child exists in and knows more of heaven than we're ever going to know until we recover it by a long process of spiritual discipline and training of the eye. But it's all there. And in that sense, the child then is the source of wisdom and vision. And this was a radical reversal of the social mores of the late 18th century, when children were, inconveniently little, but dressed in adults' clothes and put to adults' work as soon as was feasible. It's a completely different approach. But trailing down clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to what he's about to do here. He's now going to take you through the stages of life. Just notice this as it comes. We go infancy, growing boy, youth, and then man. He's taking you through, as the key stages of development. But he's seeing that there is growth, but there is loss. Let's see how he puts it. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. That's so dark, but so true, and more true perhaps in his time than it is now, though still true for lots of children in many other cultures. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. So even the boy still knows. The boy still knows, but he can begin to see the shades of the prison house of adulthood kind of, dawning upon him. The youth who daily further from the east must travel. The east there is your understanding of the sunrise and the sun setting. And in a way, he's alluding to that whole thing, which much later became terribly cliched, where you have the splendid morning of your youth and the high noon of your labour and productivity, and then the long, dark tea time of the soul, which we're all, and then inevitably, you're going to end up in some kind of awful rest home, which will, without failure, be called Sunset View, as you westering. Now, I don't know, Donne was rather out of fashion at the time that Wordsworth was writing this, whether he was aware of Donne's poem, Good Friday, 1613, Riding Westward, where Donne says, I'm being forced by circumstance to go west towards my declining and my death, but actually my soul's form bends towards the east. There will I see a sun by rising set, and by that setting endless day beget. And that poem is about literally reorientation, turning around. And of course, what lies behind it is the orientation, again, literally using that word, towards the east, of all churches. We travel chronologically from east to west, from the sort of sunrise of youth to the sunset of old age. But in terms of our life as Christians, the direction is the opposite. Though our outer nature is wasting away, says Paul, our inner nature is being renewed every day according to the image of Christ. We do not see, we don't behold the things that are on the outside because they're passing, but we see the things on the inside. And all of us are moving from a death towards a birth. And that's why churches are... So at the west door of the church is the font. And all those who are baptized, do you know that when you were baptized into the death of Christ, as well as into his resurrection. That's why baptism is a mimesis of drowning. For a Christian, you get your dying over early, at the font, and then you travel spiritually towards the east. Lewis got this completely. I mean, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is, a lot of the stories come out of either the journeys to the Hesperides or the Navigatio of Brendan, which are all seeking islands in the west. But Lewis says, no, we're treading the dawn. We're going towards the east. Aslan's country is in the east. We're moving towards a sunrise and a birth. And that's what we do as we move through the church towards the altar, where we see the resurrection proclaimed, and the sun rises in the east. Which is why I find it a bit frustrating when I go to churches sometimes that have got magnificent carved fonts whose very iconography says all that. And then, because they want to do a baptism at the family service, they wheel out some little thing that looks like a dentist's spittoon. And, baptize the child in that because it's at the front, Anyway, it's neither here nor there. Still is nature's priest. Did he know George Herbert's poem, Providence? Man is the world's high priest. That we have to somehow celebrate and consecrate everything and bring it through, as it were, the isthmus of our shared humanity with Christ into God. So the youth who daily further from the east must travel still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. So we should look to our teenagers as well for intimations of immortality, and they've got it. You listen to them and listen to the music they listen to, and it's full of it. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. So we've lost it again. You see, he's kind of had it. And though that very word common that we had earlier, celestial and common, how do we bring them back together? Earth fills her lap with pleasures of her own. Yearning she hath in her own natural kind, and even with something of a mother's mind, and no unworthy aim, the homely nurse doth all she can to make her foster child, her inmate man, forget the glories he hath known, and that imperial palace whence he came. So that's very interesting. Nature here is not a quasi-deified mother nature, but is, although she has a mother's mind and no unworthy aim, she is a foster mother, a nurse. We have a different parenthood. So again, there's a witness to this transcendence, to this otherness, to this yearning for a home, which is God, of which every other home is a kind of echo or a reminder, but through which we pass towards this. And yet nature says, oh, well, he's lost it. Let me make it as good for him here as I can. Let me be beautiful and bountiful and blossoming. But actually, I know really he wants something else. Behold the child among his newborn blisses. We suddenly go back now to the child. The 6 years darling of a pygmy size. Sad line, that. See where mid-work of his own hand he lies, fretted by sallies of his mother's kisses. I really like that. I think little sallies of his mother's kisses. With light upon him from his father's eyes. Then what Wordsworth does now is notice the kind of curious paradox. Wordsworth has just said, effectively, don't grow up, it's terrible. I've done it, believe me, you don't want to do this. Just stay there, right? And then he notices that one of the things children love to do is to pretend to be grown up. And they have all their little toys that are like the workman's tools of the kitchen or whatever it is. So this is an account of that. See at his feet some little plan or chart, some fragment of his dream of human life, shaped by himself with newly learned art, a wedding or a festival, a mourning or a funeral. And this hath now his heart, and unto this he frames his song. Then will he fit his tongue to dialogues of business, love or strife. There's children imitating their parents, saying the things there. But it will not be long ere this be thrown aside, and with new joy and pride the little actor cons another part, filling from time to time his humorous stage with all the persons down to palsied age that life brings with her in her equipage, as if his whole vocation were endless imitation. That's a nice little, that's a genuine observation of children. And then he, having described the child as it were over there in the third person, he turns to address this child. And there, now we come back to some of the great phrases of this poem in my view. Thou whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity. That's a great phrase, and it's true. Because we've submitted to what Coleridge called the despotism of the eye, or only consulting our senses, we somehow think that a shorter person is shorter or smaller in themselves, and a taller person is taller, and all this stuff. And we can't glimpse the immensity. I mean, Paul talks about that you may know the length and breadth and height and depth, and know the love of God which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Until, really, Newton's optics, people assumed, they didn't have the idea, which may turn out to be false anyway, that all the light comes in here and then there's some kind of weird little theatre in the brain that makes the images and everything is tiny in there. The previous view was that the soul goes out to meet what it sees, which is actually our experience. We see, all of this is comprehended by us in our minds. But that's an ancient idea we've just completely forgotten, that our soul, as well as being immortal, is astonishing. It's vast. It has depths we've never sounded and heights to which we've never ascended, you know. And the world, in comparison with it, is like a speck of dust. But we're temporarily on the speck of dust and we forget the dimensions of our own souls. So, whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity. Remember what Coleridge said about getting used to the immense and vast. He doesn't just mean, you know, mind-blowing images of the whole cosmos. He means mind-blowing images of your soul. Yet, who yet dost keep thy heritage. And this is a series of, if you like, titles, honorific, mystical titles of the child, any child, the next child you meet. Thou eye among the blind. That's very powerful. Compared with what they know and see, still know and see, we're the blind. The child is the eye among the blind. The deaf and silence reads the eternal deep, haunted forever by the eternal mind. Mighty prophet, he says, of the child, any child, seer blessed, on whom those truths do rest which we are toiling all our lives to find. In darkness lost, the darkness of the grave. That's an extraordinary thing to say. We assume that, you know, we know everything and we're going to teach the kids. This is a complete reversal of it. We're the blind and the child is the eye. The child is the mighty prophet, and the seer that you see, you have to see the word see in seer, because you've just seen thou eye amongst the blind, which we are toiling all our lives to find. In darkness lost, the darkness of the grave. Thou, over whom thy immortality broods like the day, a master or a slave, a presence which is not to be put by. But most of our education consists of insisting children put that by, you know, and learn to use a calculator. Yeah. Thou little child, yet glorious in the might of heaven-born freedom, on thy being's height. Notice the immensity of the soul again. Why, with such earnest pains, dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee like a weight heavy as frost. The usual, the custom and lethargy, the film of familiarity. Don't lose that vision. And then he suddenly realized that the very fact that he's remembering all this stuff and the very fact that he's writing it means that it can't be completely dead in him. If he was completely dead in him, you know, he wouldn't have taken the risk of being a poet, you know. So he would have, you know, had some steady job, you know, in the Inland Revenue. Of course, later he did. I mean, this is the tragedy. Later, of course, he became the collector of stamps, which I used to think was stamp collecting, but it was the duty. He became precisely working for the excise in Westmoreland. And, you know, Browning was just heartbroken and wrote rather severely of Wordsworth, just for a handful of silver he left us, just for a ribbon to stick on his coat. But anyway, he wasn't doing that then, you know. He still sees it and he realizes he's still got it. Oh, joy that in, do you see that word joy again? It's threaded like a kind of golden thread through here. Oh, joy that in our embers is something that doth live, that nature yet remembers what was so fugitive. The thought of our past years in me doth breed perpetual benediction. Extraordinarily ecclesial language there for a natured poet. Perpetual, yes, you know, lux eterna, you know, perpetual benediction. Not indeed for that which is most worthy to be blessed, delight and liberty, the simple creed of childhood, whether busy or at rest, with new-fledged hope still fluttering in his breast. Not for these I raise the song of thanks and praise. It's not kids being cute and playing. It's something else they've got. I raise the song of thanks and praise for those, this is great. Every teacher should be reminded of this. For those obstinate questionings of sense and outward things, fallings from us, vanishings, blank misgivings of a creature moving about in worlds not realized. That's astonishing. There's something in the kid who realizes he's losing something and saying, why are you telling me that only what I see is there? I know there's more, moving about in worlds not realized, high instincts before which our mortal nature did tremble like a guilty thing surprised. But for those first affections, those shadowy recollections, which be they what they may, are yet the fountain light of all our day, are yet a master light of all our seeing. That's the point of recovery in this poem. Up until now he said, I had it, I've lost it. Now he's saying, look, the very fact that I know that I've lost it means I've still got it. Otherwise I wouldn't know. And that early light, that heaven that lay about me, in my infancy, that glory in the freshness green, has got to be in here somewhere. And it needs to become the master light of all our seeing, the fountain light of all our day. That's just magnificent. Uphold us, cherish, and have power to make, this is again one of the great phrases of this poem, power to make our noisy years seem moments in the being of the eternal silence. Have you not had that experience? Sometimes you look at some years of your life and they were just noisy years. And there wasn't as much life or truth in one of those noisy years as there might be in one moment standing at the end of the clean peninsula and looking at the sun or seeing Bardsey. Those are moments in the being of the eternal silence, truths that wake to perish never, which, and here's the joy, this is the thing, there's some of these things can never be taken away from you, notwithstanding the way that your entire society is rigged to try and do so. So he says, which neither listlessness nor mad endeavour, isn't that a perfect description of the two things between which we oscillate in contemporary culture? Listlessness, kind of mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, or mad endeavour. Oh God, I've got to do 15 things this weekend, We oscillate between listlessness and mad endeavour, and I'm as guilty as the rest. This is one of my mad endeavours. But nor man nor boy, nor all that is at enmity with joy can utterly abolish or destroy. Yes, there's some things that will never be taken away, and we'll retain them, and they become the fountain light and the master light of all our seeing. Then comes an image which I think I've been reflecting on actually all weekend, because just to go over the brow and see the sea, and this morning when I went down, the children were sporting on the sand, they were playing, and these lines came back in all their fullness. Hence, in a season of calm weather, though inland far we be, our souls have sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, can in a moment travel thither and see the children sport upon the shore and hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. That's just the heart of the poem, that the sea of the being and goodness and light of God's love is still there. We're travelling inland, as it were, away from it, but inland far we be, in a season of calm weather. Like a place like this, a season like this, suddenly we see it. This poem, although he makes some strictures about it in his lecture, The Weight of Glory, this poem was extremely important to C.S. Lewis. Wordsworth was extremely important to C.S. Lewis. I mean, it's not for nothing that he called his spiritual autobiography Surprised by Joy, quoting Wordsworth's Surprised by Joy, impatient as the wind, I turn to share the rapture I with whom. And I sometimes wonder at the very end of the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where after the glories and splendours of sort of the feast at Cair Paravel and the thrones, he just puts in this little scene of the children going down to the sea and playing in the sea. So his kings and queens have not lost the childlike in them. And I think that's just a nod to this moment in the Ode on Intimations. Then sing, ye birds, sing a joyous song, and let the young lambs bound as to the taper's sound. We in thought will join your throng, ye that pipe and ye that play, ye that through your hearts today feel the gladness of the May. What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight? Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, but rather find strength in what remains behind, in the primal sympathy which having been must ever be, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind, and O ye fountains, meadows, hills, and groves, forebode not any severing of our loves. Yet in my heart of hearts I feel your might. I only have relinquished one delight, to live beneath your more habitual sway. I love the brooks which down their channels fret, even more than when I tripped lightly as they. The innocent brightness of a newborn day is lovely yet. The clouds that gather round the setting sun do take a sober colouring from an eye that hath kept watch o'er man's mortality. Another race hath been, and other palms are won. Thanks to the human heart by which we live. Thanks to its tenderness, its joys and fears. To me, the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. And this extraordinary kind of ends the poem. I love that phrase, bring back the hour of splendor in the grass. There's the beginning of Walt Whitman right there. Walt Whitman wouldn't have written Leaves of Grass if he hadn't read this. Or glory in the flower. Maybe Dylan Thomas, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. It's not only a poem which is rich in those phrases that feed the soul and capable of connecting you again with your own childhood, but it's also an extraordinarily generative poem. I could on another occasion, but I won't now, just go through it and show you how many poems were born out of the richness of this poem. It's quite extraordinary. So I've overspoken already, but I hope that gives you some glimpse of obviously the importance of childhood in Coleridge and Wordsworth, but they're both important influences. Coleridge more than Wordsworth, I would say, on RS, particularly Coleridge's ideas of imagination. RS is very clear about, as he makes clear in amongst other places in that glorious poem, In a Thicket in Clean. But I hope that gives you something, and thank you for listening.